Good day, everyone! Londononion here with our first Engineer Prime build, fitting for the Apocalypse difficulty. And our accompanying archetype for today's build is the Summoner. We've paired these two before, but with the Summoner as our Prime. With the change up in our primary archetype, the strategical meta will be more geared to the Engineer. Both the Summoner and the Engineer are similar in this Onion's opinion, in that their main means of offense is rooted in their skills. The Engineer with their heavy weapon, and the Summoner with their minions. I like the way their archetype traits work together. The Engineer bolsters defenses with increased armor effectiveness, and the Summoner recovers 1.5 health regenerated per second. Their perks, however, don't perfectly line up outside of the Dominator and Metal Worker perks. Both grant an increase in skill damage, and everything is more so advantageous to the respective archetype. But that is not to say that this is a practical mismatch. We'll explore how these two can be tied together, starting with the build. Now, strictly for demonstration purposes, I go with the Engineer/Technician armor set, which will put us in the heavy bracket. The goal is to have high armor, not necessarily heavy encumbrance, but I will leave this up to preference. The relic I favor is the Enlarged Heart for its efficiency, but a very close second is the Runed Heart for both health and mod power. The shards I employ are armor effectiveness, skill cooldowns, and mod/skill casting speed. Moving on to the armaments, the primary I go with is the Bonesaw LMG. Our secondary is the MP60, and our melee weapon is again a preferential option, but I equip the Atom Splitter. Now, I experimented a fair amount with different mods to aid the success of this build, and the majority of our stock footage involves the Skewer and Helix mods. The logic behind these two I'll explain later, but the mods that I had chosen for the final product are the Space Crabs and Familiar. I equipped Space Crabs on the Bonesaw with the Bandit Mutator for greater ammo efficiency and a useful boost in fire rate. The MP60 takes Familiar with the Refunder Mutator, which serves a similar purpose to Bandit, but is more so geared to longevity. As for the melee weapon, I apply Reinvigorate for a reduction in charged melee cost and a 20% increase in charged attacks with a 10% buff in critical chance. This Mutator, though, is not integral to the overall success of this build, and can be left up to preference. Now we can move on to the fun part, the jewelry. The amulet leading this build is the Soul Anchor, which increases all damage by 20% while at least one summon is active. Moving on to the rings, I employ Burden of the Rebel, a Terry Booster, Soul Link, and Soul Guard. Burden of the Rebel reduces relic use speed by 25% and reduces skill cooldowns by 15%. A Terry Booster increases heavy weapon damage and critical chance by 10% whether held or in turret mode. Soul Link grants 5% of base damage from summons as lifesteal to the caster. Lastly, Soul Guard grants a stack of Bulwark for each active summon. Transitioning to the traits and skills, I apply Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Barkskin, Blood Bond, Recovery, Rugged, and Siphoner. As for the skill settings, for the Engineer, I favor the Impact Cannon, both for handheld and remote use. For the Summoner, I favor the Flyers, though Hollows are a fair alternative. Alright, now we can transition to the application and limitations. So I think it's important first to briefly expose the intended use of this build, and this will help clear our armor and choices of trinkets. Now the Engineer has 2, maybe 3 options for using their heavy weapon. They can hold it in hand, place it on the ground to assist with targeted foes, or allow it to fire autonomously with the single press command. The primary means of operating this build from an offensive standpoint is to keep that bad boy equipped in hand. The main reason for this is the increase in damage. When the heavy weapon is placed on the ground, the damage is essentially cut in half. Additionally, the aura of the magnetic field, which grants a 15% damage reduction and restores ammo, is only 2.5 meters. Especially with the overclocked feature, having the weapon in hand is more worth one's time with the Engineer as the prime. This offensive strategy turns the Engineer into a burst damage machine, allowing one to issue roughly 1,500 plus units of damage per connected shot. Overclocked and critical damage increases this further to 2,000 to 2,500 damage units, not including weak spot hits. Now I know, y'all are ready to jump down my throat with the deficits that come from carrying the heavy weapon. Yes, you are slower, you are clunky, your evades are trickier to time, you have limited access to alternative skills, melee prowess is subpar, and you have to place that bad boy down or put it away if you wish to use any quick slot items. Due to our skill selection of the impact cannon, fire rate is naturally low, and dealing with multiple targets up close is a dangerous tactic, though I will admit, the gun buck on this heavy weapon packs quite a punch. But, with all of this in mind, our rings, mods, armor, and secondary archetype are intended to compensate. Although melee use with the cannon is far from ideal, our armor effectiveness mixed with the damage reduction of summons allows one to sustain a good amount of punishment. The impact cannon in hand is superb with handling targets from afar, or tough enemies, even when close by. But this almost reminds me of, let's just say, the Hunter class in wielding a Widowmaker. Great burst damage against particular targets, but will have a difficult time up close, unless you're just a master with this thing. The Summoner Flyers are like assistants to the Engineer. They naturally add to the volume of projectiles on the field, and will seek out enemies that are not obvious to the caster. To help with overcoming numerous enemies, I had originally thought to employ mods that could efficiently deal damage to multiple enemies at once. Helix is a fun mod, but really needs to be boosted with rings, an appropriate amulet, or an alternative secondary archetype. Plus, it is too expensive for the output and available charges, in this onion's opinion. Skewer had a similar logic, but was not autonomous enough for this onion's liking. So to craft this war machine, I switch out the missiles and bombs for otherworldly wings of death and kamikaze bugs. But this is only half the story for operating this build, and will transition us to the efficacy of the other half. Though holding the cannon is the primary offensive means, placing it down plays a strong role for defensive and evasive purposes. When the heavy weapon is in turret mode, it counts as a summon and will contribute to one's bulwark stacks. Additionally, Soul Link will give a boost to the caster's health recovery, and despite the reduction in the cannon's damage, it becomes more widespread. Plus, one can freely use their mods and maximize bulwark stacks with Space Crabs and Familiar. Now this style of offense implies use for when holding the cannon is too dangerous and evasion/defensive tactics are more important, such as when health is too low or maneuverability needs to be heightened in the face of devastating enemies. Now the intended use of this build is not to suggest that one's main weapons take a back seat. After all, the heavy weapon does not have to be used for every enemy encounter, but is meant to be part of a larger cycle of ammo expenditure, with the heavy weapon taking the lead. The primary and secondary are quite ammo heavy, and this can be offset by their mutators and the engineer heavy weapon for ammo restoration. I like to think of this build as a disarticulated modern-day Abrams tank, and you are the main cannon, while your summons are the accompanying machine guns and small arms fire for when the tank is overwhelmed or has sustained too much damage, if you will. But taking a step back from the abstraction, this onion wouldn't argue that this is the easiest means of using the engineer. Now the limitations of this build are mainly skill related, given the downsides of holding the heavy weapon, having good familiarity with enemy attack patterns, and being gun confident as opposed to gun shy is necessary. Since this is more of a skill disposition, I wouldn't necessarily call this a limitation, but the margin for error is smaller, and I would not recommend this build for beginners. Additionally, airborne, range-based, and nimble enemies add more stress to accurately using the heavy weapon due to the charge feature, which this onion would say is more of a mechanical limitation than skill. Now this onion is definitely not the best there is in flawless evasion and enemy familiarity, but I think I can objectively say that one is at a disadvantage against certain enemies with the heavy weapon, which could warrant a change in offensive means, i.e. just use your damn primary when the task calls for it. Now I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.